Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where each week I answer a film-related question submitted by a member of the BMFI community. This week's question: can you explain the story behind the 1948 Paramount Decree? Sure, the 1948 Paramount Decree, the Hollywood studio decree, the Paramount decision, the antitrust decree, whatever you want to call it, came about in 1948 because for years the United States Department of Justice had filed suits and other actions against a number of the Hollywood studios for antitrust violations, basically claiming and rightfully and fairly claiming that they were engaged in unfair and unlawful business practices that primarily stemmed from their vertical integration, the studio's vertical integration, and their unusual level of cooperation among organizations or companies that are supposed to be competitors. The vertical integration has to do with the extent to which a single company controlled so much of the movie making and movie going experience. Now, no single studio controlled the whole filmmaking and film going experience across the country, but there were some that controlled it in segments of the country, portions, regions of the country, and amongst the handful of the big studios at the time and their cooperation amongst themselves, they had a stranglehold on filmmaking and film distribution and film exhibition in the United States. Really probably from the late teens or early 20s through around 1948 or 1950 by the time things get going. Basically, each of the major studios, your Paramounts, your Columbias, your Universals, your MGMs, were vertically integrated entities, which meant that if I went to see a Warner Brothers movie in a Warner Brothers owned theater, which is where I would have seen it in certain regions of the country, certainly in the among the Great Lake states and Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, so on. If I went to see a Warner Brothers movie there, then basically everybody involved in the making and distribution exhibition of that movie, from the person who came up with the idea for the movie, the idea for the screenplay, to the person who sold me my popcorn, and everybody in between, all worked for Warner Brothers. And if I saw a Paramount movie in a Paramount theater in a different part of the country, like the Mountain West, then the same thing could be true. That person was a Paramount employee, from coming up with the idea for the movie or acquiring the property for the movie that would turn to the screenplay, to selling me my popcorn, and everybody in between all worked for the studio. And this made it very difficult for anyone who didn't work with or wasn't affiliated with those studios to make a movie and get it shown anywhere or distributed anywhere, because these studios also had sort of exclusivity contracts with Kodak and with makers of film equipment. Not all of them, but by and large. But also they the studios owned the majority of the best theaters in the most populous and lucrative parts of the country. And if by chance some independent theater owner operator wanted to show a movie that wasn't one of theirs, well, then there would be some retribution from the studio. So are you going to take a chance on a sort of independent movie made outside of the studio system if that runs you the risk of not being able to show Casablanca when it comes out? I don't think you're going to. And so this, and not only did they have this arrangement, not only did they have um, the sort of, you know, commercial or industrial muscle to make these sorts of decisions, they engaged in all sorts of unfair business practices, things like block booking, namely that, you know, oh, you'd like to show Casablanca when it comes out. Well, if you want to show Casablanca when it comes out at the end of the year, between now and the end of the year, you're going to also show these 10 movies for as long as we tell you to show them, no matter how good or bad they are, no matter how much interest you have in them or your audience has in them. Because if you don't show these movies, regardless of how they will, what sort of product they will be for your business and what sort of business they will do for your theater, then you won't get Casablanca at the end. So things like that. And that sort of business practice is just really sort of the simplest to understand among the many similar practices that the industry would exercise during that time. And so basically the thought was, and like I said, most of the major studios were subject to similar actions, and these had been going on for years, and Paramount decided to settle in 1948. And once Paramount settled, it sort of set the groundwork and created the template for the other major studios to settle, and that's what happened. And the consent, the thing that these studios consented to in the consent decree, as this is sometimes called, is, in addition to stopping those illegal business practices about booking films and things like that, which they never stopped, the big thing that they agreed to do and that they did have to do was divest themselves of their movie theaters. So the Justice Department basically said to them, all right, you want to make this go away? Here's what you have to do. You have to get rid, right now you produce, distribute, and exhibit movies. You can't do all three. So what do you want to get rid of? And, you know, they chose to get rid of exhibition. And they chose to sell off their theaters. And one can imagine why they wanted to do that. That was the sort of segment of the business that was farthest from their bases. I mean, they were all over the place, owning and controlling and being responsible for maintaining property, or a facility like a movie theater, particularly an aging movie theater, can be expensive and challenging, particularly if you're trying to do it at a distance. They had already gone through changing the theaters over from silent to sound, and that was a very expensive process, and they had reason to think that other such processes would be coming down the line, and those were infrastructure expenses I'm sure they didn't want. And they probably figured that if we maintain our stranglehold on production and exhibition, then, you know, we'll still get to dictate what the production and distribution. If we maintain our stranglehold on production and distribution, we'll still largely get to dictate the exhibition side of the business. And by and large, they were right. Of course, the industry changed over time. The industry lost its stranglehold on production, and more recently distribution that they once had. But and so it's for this reason, this is sort of seen as the beginning of the end of the studio system, because they were no longer operating under the most favorable for them business circumstances, and they no longer had the most favorable for them corporate structure, and they lost some leverage. And, you know, the fact that they didn't own theaters anymore made it a little bit easier for European art films to come into the country in the 1950s. And it made it a little bit easier for independent producers of genre movies like horror producer William Castle, and later on American AIP and other folks like that, to be able, Roger Corman, and films like Easy Rider, all those things, that were these little sort of baby steps toward independent film production and distribution, really wouldn't have been able to make even those steps, if the studios still controlled the theaters the way they did. I think it's worth saying, as someone who works at a movie theater, that many of the practices that were unfair booking practices that the studios were supposed to stop, in the 1940s, they never stopped. They sort of went under the table, but what they used to be willing to say, overtly, they would imply, and things like that. So the business changed, but they still, as shouldn't be a surprise, they still took every opportunity to have every advantage they could. Interestingly, at the end of the uh, Trump administration, the decision was made by the Department of Justice to basically sort of let the consent decrees be eliminated, to go away, to no longer have them on the books or enforced. Um, I don't know what the proper term for that is, but that decision was made at the end of 2019, I believe, and a number of organizations representing movie theaters primarily objected to it considerably, and there was a court case about it. But at the sort of last sort of state of things was that there's going to be a 2-year sunset period, where a number of those practices that the studios had agreed to um, stop engaging in, but many of which they actually didn't, they would no longer be forced to stop engaging in. And the reason for the thought that those rules are no longer as relevant, or those agreements should no longer need to still be binding, is because the film distribution and exhibition and consumption businesses have changed so significantly. And in that regard, it's hard to argue with that single point, right? Whether the fact that a company or companies that hold a smaller or a weaker stranglehold, I guess I should say, or a weaker hold on an industry, should still be allowed to engage in certain unsavory practices, because they're not as all powerful as they once were. I don't know about the morality or logic of that, but what I will say is that when you have Netflix, and when you have Amazon, and when you have far more and more robust independent theaters, and you have people watching movies in a host of different ways, it's hard to argue that practices that were outlawed based on the state of the American film industry in 1948 still necessarily anyway apply today. I see that logic. And just as with regulation of cable television, it all depends on what you consider to be that industry, and what you consider to be, you know, competition, and what the field or realm of competition is. I mean, are we talking about the viewing of movies, period? Are we talking about the viewing of movies in theaters? Are we talking about things made for theatrical release, um, and who makes them, and where they get seen and how they get seen? So, how those things are defined, will obviously impact the decisions about the continued necessity for these rules. But when people talk about the Paramount Decree, they talk about 1948 as a turning point in American film history and in the studio system. That's what they're talking about. But it still has ramifications even to the present day. So I was glad to be able to have this opportunity to talk about this topic, and it's a very interesting topic, as I said, with wide ranging and ongoing ramifications. So um, I, I appreciate the question. And if you have a film-related question you would like me to try and answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and find the Ask Andrew form. Who knows? Next time I could be answering a question you sent in.